If you were asked to pick out a success story from the last 14 years of education policy, I'm sure some people would point to England's rise in the international rankings for global tests such as PISA. In 2022, England came 11th for maths, up from 27th in 2009. That's why I was intrigued to see recent reports claim that the way we teach and assess maths needs to be overhauled to make up for several perceived problems. One of those reports came from the Royal Society's Mathematical Futures Project, with the Royal Society's president, Sir Adrian Smith, claiming that not only is radical reform necessary, but, quote, politicians who fail to grasp the nettle are failing our young people. So what are these apparent problems with maths in primary and secondary education? Does the maths curriculum need a few tweaks or a major rethink? And should we have more maths exams in schools and colleges, or fewer exams, or perhaps just different exams? Both my guests are former maths teachers and former head teachers. Lynn McClure OBE is a trustee at National Numeracy and the Academy for Mathematical Sciences and was also a board member of the Royal Society's recent project. And David Thomas OBE is the CEO at Axiom Maths and a former government advisor. I'm Tom Richmond, the director of the EDSK think tank, and to find out why maths lessons may need to change, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast from the education and skills think tank EDSK that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including schools, colleges, universities and apprenticeships. You can find out more about EDSK's research at edsk.org or on Twitter at EDSK Think Tank.
The Royal Society's Mathematical Futures programme was an ambitious project, to say the least. It took 4.5 years to reach its conclusions. Lynn, after all that discussion, debate and analysis at the Royal Society, what would you draw out as the main concerns that the programme highlighted in terms of maths education in schools and colleges?
Well, you're right, Tom. It did take 4.5 years. It was a very interesting 4.5 years. And I think we've come to some reasonable conclusions, which so far seem to be landing quite well. I think the main one, which is reflected in the title, is the fact that we've called it mathematical and data education rather than mathematics education. I think that's the big takeaway, is that in this world of increased data everywhere, we need to make sure that we embed that in the school curriculum. But in terms of more sort of detailed or things underneath that, early years, there's a lack of anything about shape and space. It is in the curriculum, but it's not in the early learning goals. And we know that shape and space is really important, not only for kids' understanding about geometry later on, but it also impacts on their understanding of number. So it's a really important thing. And we know that in nurseries where teachers are really focused on meeting the early learning goals, they will be focused only on number. And that makes quite a difference for girls, because typically boys get given Lego and girls get given Barbies. I mean, that's a bit of an extreme view, but it is true that girls get much less opportunity to do shape and space, building things and putting things together. In Key Stage 1, I think the big story is we need sensible use of calculators. Previous secretaries of state have found calculator use abominable, so they don't allow it in primary schools. And of course, a calculator is a fantastic tool for allowing students to do some exploration of number. And it shouldn't obviously be in the place of being able to do calculations, but using a calculator properly and knowing about estimation, knowing whether your answer is about right, is a really, really important tool. Key Stage 3 was regarded as a bit of a desert. Kids move into Key Stage 3 from primary school, and quite often, I'm sure David will talk a bit more about that, but things go a bit pear-shaped then. And of course, there's a huge lack of qualified teachers for mathematics in Key Stage 3. Key Stage 4, teaching to the test, of course, that's going to happen. and the horrible thing about having to retake and retake and retake, which is condemning students to hate maths even more. And each time they take a retake, they have less chance of passing than they did the time before. So it's a really pretty negative loop. And in Key Stage 5, the Royal Society really applauded core maths, which is one of those qualifications now that students can take if they're not taking A-level mathematics. And it's got quite a lot of data literacy in it. And we think that there should be more of that, because otherwise students only have the chance of doing A-level. There's nothing else for them to do there, unless they're doing a T-level, which includes some mathematical stuff. But the whole narrowing of the curriculum post-16, we think needs to be widened out. And lastly, the fact that most schools now don't offer AS maths. So AS used to be a bridging part to A-level maths. So you might do AS maths in your first year of the sixth form and then finish it off in the second year. That's now not being offered because it doesn't count towards an A-level. And that, we know, has disproportionately affected the number of girls taking mathematics, because girls quite like to try things out first before they plump for the big thing.
Okay, a huge breadth of things to look at. So a focus on maths and data education rather than just maths. Some concern around early years in Key Stage 1, so those first few years of primary school. Even the movement into secondary school around Key Stage 3. Maybe it's a bit of a desert, not enough teachers in the right place. Key Stage 4, looking at going up to GCSE, so concerns around teaching to the test. And then even post-16, the impact of GCSE resits. Thumbs up for core maths, but maybe the narrowing of the curriculum overall is still a problem. Thank you, Lynn. Lots to digest there. So that's where the Royal Society ended up in their final report. David, how much of the Royal Society's perspective do you share in relation to what isn't working? And is there anything else that you think should be part of the conversation around the weaknesses with primary and secondary maths?
I'll pick up where Lynn suggested I would, having spent under 4.5 years of intense work looking at this. So at Axiom, we've been doing a lot of work trying to understand why there are so many children who are enjoying maths and doing well at maths at 11 who aren't in that same position by the time they're 16. And we know that there's a tremendous attrition rate there. It's about 50% for children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. So there's something going wrong. And all of our research suggests that's happening in Key Stage 3. And that in particular, it's happening right at the start of Key Stage 3. So we did this piece of work last year surveying children in year 6, 7, 8 and 9 to understand how their attitudes to maths were shifting over the course of the transition into secondary school. And we found that the big drop-off happens between year 6 and year 7. It is that first year of secondary school. There are things happening in year 8 and 9 that are interesting as well, but the big thing to think about is year 7. And what we found is that particularly for children who are doing well at maths at primary school, they find the transition to secondary very hard, and it completely shifts their attitudes. So they start to find maths less fun, they start to find it easier, they start to find it more boring, they find it a bit more stressful. So all of these shifts happen as they move from year 6 into year 7. Now, that's not something that is a result of secondary schools messing it up, right? One of the reasons we know that is that the opposite happens to the lowest attainers. So the lowest attainers, as they're moving from primary into secondary school, actually like secondary maths more. But the higher attainers, they don't. So they have a much worse experience of maths. And I think that's all sorts of things. I mean, Lynn talks about teaching. That's definitely a thing. So 40% of year 7s we asked had not had the same maths teacher all year during year 7 at the end of the year. And that's a pretty big proportion of children who are having turnover. And of those who do have the same teacher, lots of those were being taught by someone whose main subject isn't maths. And so we definitely have something going on there in terms of who is teaching our Key Stage 3 maths. But the main thing that children told us about was their curriculum experience and their teaching experience, that they found Key Stage 3 very, very repetitive of what they'd done in primary, and that they found it much more procedural, and that there was much less space for them to be exploring interesting maths and really, really pushing themselves. And that very often the incentives that they then faced in that world with a simpler curriculum, maybe a less expert teacher or a less consistent teacher, were all just about, can you exercise the procedure quickly, well, and without making any mistakes? Now, of course, that's a really important thing to be able to do, right? Put the caveat in. You need to be able to exercise procedures well and quickly and without making mistakes. But if that is the sole experience that you have of mathematics, and the sole incentive that you are given is being able to do that, that obviously, changes your experience and makes it much, much less rich than it could be. So that's a thing that we find. The other thing that is interesting is the social dynamic around mathematics. So children, as they move from primary into secondary school, are reinventing themselves. They're deciding who they want to be in this new world and getting to form and shape an identity. And very often they are choosing to cut maths out of that. They don't want to be seen as somebody who is good at maths because there's seen to be a social cost to that. Now, I think that's actually an imagined social cost. We've also done research trying to understand this more, understand people's attitudes to maths around the country. And people in Britain are actually much more positive about maths than maths teachers like me tend to think they are and tend to say they are. But those children who are good at maths are very self-conscious about it and are almost self-censoring much more than there might actually be reason to do if you go and ask other children whether they want to be friends with someone who's good at maths. They're not really thinking about it. The children who are good at maths are very worried.
It's a fascinating range of psychological and sociological issues there to look at, certainly, and then that compounds perhaps some of the things that the Royal Society found as well across all the different key stages. So we've got a lot of problems to try and have a look at. Let's dig into some of these, because there is at least a tentative recognition from the new Labour government that something does indeed need to change with how we teach maths. The Labour Party's 2024 election manifesto said that, quote, "The last Labour government's promotion of phonics put rocket boosters under the reading and writing ability of a generation of children. We will do the same for numeracy, improving the quality of maths teaching across nurseries and primary schools." Now, for anyone not familiar with phonics, it's essentially a way of teaching children how to read by teaching them the sounds of letters and combinations of letters so that they can combine the letters and sounds together to pronounce a word. Phonics has been shown to be very successful in this country and other countries too as a method of teaching reading to young children. David, if during your time as a government advisor, a minister had said to you, phonics works great for teaching reading, so now we need phonics for maths to teach children maths, what do you think your reaction would have been to that?
I mean, my first reaction would probably be to remind them that, of course, the analogy breaks down pretty quickly, right? Phonics for maths, and what does that mean? Maths is not constructed in the way that reading is constructed, and so there isn't a direct analogy there, right? From grapheme-phoneme relationships to something in maths. So my first question would be, well, what do you mean by that? And I think what this government mean is that there is something to learn from having a curriculum that chunks down learning into very small blocks so that you can focus in on making sure that you are learning that discrete block and learning it really, really well so that you can then combine it with previous things that you've learned to be able to build up to a greater whole. And that doing that in early number can be a helpful thing. I think that is what this government means by that. And if that's what they mean by that, then I think that's something that I've got a lot of sympathy for. But of course, there are many bridges to cross between saying phonics for maths and having something that's going out into classrooms.
Lynn, what do you make of the idea of phonics for maths? Do you think it could address some of the issues that you raised in your Royal Society report, particularly around early years and Key Stage 1, the start of primary school?
I think there's already a pretty good curriculum for early years. The problem is that the members of staff generally who are working with those children do not have the expertise to be able to recognise when children are working mathematically. So if you look at the training that early years teachers, I'm talking about nursery teachers really, if you look at the training that they have, the government's even removed the necessity for them to have a GCSE in mathematics. Not that a GCSE in mathematics, I have to say, is the be and end all, but it's an indication that they haven't even got a GCSE in mathematics. So if you look at the early years goals, they are really good. they talk a lot about this understanding of having very rich experiences with number in lots and lots of different contexts. And the idea about the staff there is that they bring out the mathematics that the children are beginning to talk about, and then in their play, and then they formalise that. So that formalising would be one of the small chunks that David was talking about. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the curriculum. I think what could be improved is the professionalism and the knowledge of the people who work with very small children, so that they recognise when mathematical activity is happening and they can build on it and know how to support children in moving on into the next sort of block.
Okay, so a tentative thumbs up from both of you in terms of maybe there's a nugget of an idea around building blocks of learning in maths, but perhaps we shouldn't expect too much from phonics for maths just at this point, particularly when there are so many other issues that may need addressing. One of which is this fascinating question of not necessarily what you teach, but how you teach it, and this debate over whether maths should be done by hand or on the computer. To slightly caricature the two ends of this spectrum, I've come across people arguing that doing maths by hand is essential to understanding concepts, giving children and young people a solid foundation in the subject, and ultimately speeding up their learning by repetition and practice of core ideas. But I've seen other people arguing that doing maths by hand is outdated, it's of little relevance to the modern workplace, and it misses out on the opportunity to teach children and young people the digital skills they need in the 21st century. Lynn, my sense from the Royal Society's work was that you were leaning towards the latter position, particularly with your emphasis on maths and data education rather than just talking about maths. Is that a fair observation?
Yes, I think that is a fair observation. I think there are some amazing programmes that allow students to appreciate mathematics in a different way. So, for example, GeoGebra or Desmos. These are fantastic programmes which allow students to be presented with mathematics in a way which is much more sophisticated and much more malleable than it is on paper and pencil. So, for example, with GeoGebra, you could, for example, draw a triangle and the measurement of the angles will pop up, and you can then move one of the corners of the triangle and GeoGebra will still calculate what the angles are. And so you can see that the angles of a triangle add up to 180, no matter what you do to the shape of that triangle. And that's a really powerful thing, and much more powerful than drawing 15 different triangles and measuring the angles and seeing whether they come to 179 or 183 or whatever it is. So there are some fantastic programs which allow students to meet, and all students it should be part of every student's experience to be able to meet those. And there are lots and lots of really good examples of helping students to do multiple versions of something very quickly, like times tables, rock stars, and things like that, which help students to do things which otherwise would be quite boring, but which are really important. I think the main problem with computing at the moment is that we don't have the ability to really assess mathematics efficiently and effectively on the computer digitally. And people are working at that, and we have scratch pads and all the way. But we know that especially when students get to more sophisticated mathematics, and professional mathematicians too, tend to use pencil and paper a lot for their scribblings. And we haven't found a way really of doing that in the same sort of way to allow all students to have access to that. So I think it's that there's one thing that's going on in the classroom or not going on in the classroom. And then there's a sort of trying to think about how we would faithfully assess what students do in the classroom by doing it on a computer. And we haven't quite got the match between those yet.
David, what's your take on this? Do you buy the argument that we now need a greater focus on technology to support computing and digital skills in the world of maths? Or do you think doing maths by hand still has that value, which is simply not going to go away over time?
Can I say that I think both of those things, but not in a sort of trite, let's just compromise way? I mean, it seems to me that we've got different tools for doing mathematics, and what we should do is use the best tool for the particular thing that we want to do, right? The tool doesn't in and of itself have intrinsic value. The tool has value because it helps us do something. And so, take Lynn's example, right? We've both taught that triangle lesson with and without GeoGebra. And you can teach that lesson in a sort of faux investigation way where you give kids 30 different triangles, ask them to measure the angles and hope that they spot they add up to 180, where of course they never do because they never actually measure the angles accurately enough when they're trying to get through 30 of them. And so what they discover is that they add up to something roughly like 180 a lot of the time. And you don't actually get the thing you wanted versus, you can put up on the screen your dynamic GeoGebra setup you've got and show how, look, as I make this a bit bigger, this angle a bit bigger, this one gets a little bit smaller in order to achieve it. And therefore, my angles are something to 180 degrees and you can see the dynamics of that. One of those is just a better tool than the other, right? For the job that you want to do, which is demonstrating that in all of these different triangles, the angle sum is the same. It's the same with children doing maths, right? If you are trying to, calculate some statistics and you have a large data set, doing that by hand is just a really silly thing to do, right? Like no one would ever do that. That's a poor tool for the job. And there are much better tools for the job. Now, you might well want to do it by hand once or twice to appreciate what the tool is doing, right? I think it is helpful to, when you are learning what an ordinary least squares regression is, right, to do it by hand a couple of times, to understand what that algorithm is doing and therefore what your output of an ordinary least squares regression is. But doing your ordinary least squares regression by hand is a really silly thing to do. There are other bits of maths where you absolutely do it by hand. And people, as Lynn said, professionally will be doing that. Because a lot of the time, for lots of bits of maths, you think with pen and paper. I mean, when I'm doing a maths problem, think with my pen and paper. That is the process of thinking I do. I can't just do it all in my head and then transfer it over to a computer. And I can't think it with a computer. I have to use a pen and paper because that is the way that I'm doing my thinking process of sketching things out, seeing connections between numbers and so on. And so you can't remove that from mathematics because that is the thought process. And so I think we should be thinking about what are the right tools to use for the jobs that need to be done and where tools might have perverse effects, how we mitigate them. So Lynn talked earlier about calculators and using calculators more, but you also want to be concerned about people then not being able to do their mental arithmetic or their estimation because they just rely on the calculator and put the wrong answers down. Well, I don't know if you've used this, Lynn, but I was used to use these Quama calculators where it won't give you the answer unless you put a reasonable estimate in first. Now, that's the sort of thing that is a sensible, that's a tool for a job where someone's thought about the perverse effects of that tool and then come up with a really sensible way of trying to combat those or mitigate them.
Sounds like I've got a lot more to learn about the different calculators that are out there and not something I've come across. It's very, very interesting. I mean, just moving on from how maths is actually taught and the tools we use to do the teaching, there's also a very big question to tackle around how maths should be assessed and whether we have got the right number and type and mixture of assessments in primary and secondary education. It's certainly possible that the government's ongoing curriculum and assessment review, which concludes next year, will be looking closely at this issue, particularly around English and maths. David, GCSEs and SATs continue to attract praise and criticism. They're over 30 years old each, and we're still having this conversation about them. We've also had SATs age 14, which have come and gone. We've had more recently a new multiplication check in primary schools. When you look at the assessment landscape as a whole for maths across that 4 to 18 space, do you think we've ended up in a good place, or would you like to see something different being done?
So I'm like everyone else, right? There are things that I would change about the situation that we have. There are things that I don't quite like or that I would do differently. But I do think that on the whole, we are in a relatively good place with our maths education system. On the whole, of course, there are lots of things that I would want to tweak and would want to change. And we haven't talked much about post-16, which I think is very interesting. And there's an awful lot to do. And I think the Royal Society is putting us in the right direction on that. But below that, I actually think it's broadly okay, which I recognise is a deeply controversial thing to say. And I think we focus too much on assessment and not enough on curriculum and classroom practice. And the debate always comes back to what should you do with SATs and what should you do with GCSEs. And of course, those create some incentives that drive some stuff. But to me, I just don't see that the big problems, the first ones we need to bite off, are being driven by assessment. When I think about things like Key Stage 3, And everything that I shared earlier on about children's negative experience of maths and all of the, the children who are falling off track and having a much worse experience of maths as they come into secondary school. I feel like secondary schools only have so much capacity, right? So there is a choice. You either take that on or you give them a completely new assessment framework and, ask them to spend 5 years redesigning the way that their maths department works in order to hit that new assessment framework. And I would just much rather we focused on what I think the bigger problem is, which is in Key Stage 3. Primary, look, I'm not a primary expert, so I'm not sure what the answer is, and I'd be interested to hear from others on what they think that is. There is a really interesting question about Key Stage 3. I know that the Royal Society's made an argument for reintroducing assessment at the end of Year 9. I think it is a reasonable argument. I'm actually on the fence about this at the moment. I was a big fan of removing Year 9 SATs when they were removed. That correlates with, I think, some issues going on in Key Stage 3, not having lots of attention paid to it, and some things going wrong in Key Stage 3. I would be cautious about the perverse incentives of adding other assessment back in, because we all know how that can go wrong. But I think it's the right discussion to be having of, like, if we were to do it, how could we do it really well? And we should think that through properly, because this is an area in need of attention.
Yes, let's pick up on that Royal Society recommendation for a new maths assessment at age 14. Lynn, just talk us through the thinking behind that proposal. Is the lack of an assessment at 14, do you think, one of the biggest weaknesses we have at the moment in the system?
I don't think we need another assessment at 14, which is a way of comparing schools. I do think it would be very useful to have something at the end of Key Stage 3, which was criterion referenced, so that students have something which is worth having, in the sense that the curriculum that they could do in Key Stage 3 would be one that was a proxy for what you need to do as an adult, the sort of maths you need to do as an adult. And if you identify the actual mathematics that is needed, it is quite a small box, and it's mostly about proportional reasoning. So when students are in primary school, their main way of reasoning is additive. They think about things getting bigger by adding things on. And then there's a sort of a shift in their thinking when they start realizing that actually if you multiply things, you've got a much better way of making things bigger. And of course, after that, then there's exponential, which is the next bit. But this idea of moving from additive to multiplicative reasoning is a really important shift. And those students who don't do well in primary school are the ones who really need much more of that in secondary school, because that whole thing about multiplicative reasoning and proportional reasoning is the basis of so much of the maths that we use in everyday life. Percentages, speed, distance, time, all of those sorts of things have got proportional and multiplicative reasoning at their root. So what the Maths Futures was talking about was saying, why don't we have something in Key Stage 3, which is sort of like a maths for life thing, and it would be criterion referenced. So the difference between criterion and norm referenced is, at the moment, nearly all of the examinations that are national examinations like GCSE and A-level, etc., are norm referenced, which means that there are only a certain percentage of those taking it who will get certain grades. That's sort of set out. And that means that no matter, even if everybody became really, really good at maths, all it would mean would be that the norm curve would shift up to the right, but it would still mean that a certain number of people would fail, even if they were much better than a previous cohort had been, because it's always the bottom group who always are not allowed to pass, really. So if you have a criterion referenced assessment, it means that if you get things right, then you get the marks. So you could have an assessment in Key Stage 3 that said, this is a really important part of mathematical knowledge that all students should have, and they should all get 85%. So the pass mark would be really high, but there wouldn't be any cut-off. There wouldn't be a limit to the number of people who could pass it. So that's what the Maths Futures was talking about. Can we put something in Key Stage 3 which would be in and of itself valuable and might even be recognised by employers as being valuable, because it's the sort of mathematics that you need for most everyday life, But even more than that, it acts as a really secure stepping stone to the more academic work that one would hope that they would do for GCSE. So it's not doing something different, which is going off at a tangent. It's focusing on a small area of mathematical content, which would then be a very good basis for further study. Just talking about the assessment in primary school, we have the multiplications test, which is a speed test. So the students have a very limited amount of time to answer each question. If they don't answer it in that time, because it's online, then they miss it. And the pass mark for that is incredibly high. It's sort of over 90%. So I think all kids should know their tables. If you have to work out what 7 6s are in the middle of doing a calculation, it takes your mind off what the calculation is and it just sort of destroys things. It's a bit like trying to write an essay where you have to keep looking up the spelling of words. It sort of detracts from your flow of thought. And most primary schools that I know, in fact, I can't think of any that don't, work on multiplication tables anyway. It's not like the test has therefore enabled students to do something that they weren't doing before. Everybody was doing multiplication tables. But the emphasis on doing things quickly, I think, is the wrong emphasis. And I know it's because they want the students to have instant recall. And I know instant recall is helpful and all the rest of it. But I think it puts an inordinate pressure on kids at a stage when I think they have to practice and practice and practice and practice until they can't get it wrong. And there are so many other more worthwhile things in mathematics that they could be doing at that time. I'd be interested to know if David agrees with me.
Let's ask him. David, what do you make of this multiplication check? It hasn't been necessarily loved by some of the teaching unions at all, who see it as an additional burden. David, do you think it's got value?
I'm sure the teaching unions wouldn't love the Royal Society's new assessment at 14 either. I'm much less negative about the multiplications tables check. They have 6 seconds, I think it is, to answer the question, right? I mean, to me, 6 seconds, I feel like if you don't know it within 6 seconds, you probably don't know it. And I don't know whether someone will have some evidence, right, about what the right time frame is. And I don't know if it's 6 seconds or 7 seconds is the optimal answer. I don't know the research, but it feels to me like there's going to be some sub 10-second number where if it takes you longer than that to know the answer, you probably don't know it. And this is the same form as the assessment you're talking about for 14, well, in that it's not used for accountability, right? They just report how many out of 25 you got correct. In some senses, that's lower stakes than an assessment at 14, which is something that you might take to an employer and say how you want to do. So I'm much less negative about it. I think it's a decent, helpful thing. On the assessment at 14, let's just remember norm referencing, and I totally get then what you're saying about why an assessment at 14 might want to be different. The way we do norm referencing does allow for that distribution to shift, right? We do a national reference test every year, and so if everyone has got better at maths, we increase the proportion of higher grades that people can have. And there's no theoretical reason why that couldn't move up to everybody being able to have much higher grades than we have now if we saw it. I think the thing you've got to be clear on for introducing a new assessment is why it's there and what problem it's trying to solve. And so if the problem we're trying to solve is we think that people are not sufficiently incentivized to be teaching this bit of maths well and we need a new incentive for them to be focusing on it, then assessment probably does solve that. But it does that by shifting incentives. And that's the thing that people don't like because that involves some kind of pressure on them by somebody. If you think it's that children are learning all of this well and they're just not being recognised, I'd want to see the evidence for that. And last time I went and sat down and looked through a big pile of grade 3 GCSE exam scripts, what I saw was children who, exactly as Lynn outlined, did not understand proportional and multiplicative reasoning. Right, that was exactly the place where you would see people trying to do multiplication by repeated addition. That's exactly the sort of thing that you see in those grade 3 exam scripts. So it seems to me we have a lot of children who are leaving secondary school, not passing GCSEs because they can't do proportional and multiplicative reasoning. And the thing we need to do is shift that. And if we want to shift focus onto that, that begs the question of what we're shifting focus off of. And how we manage that in a world where we're also saying that maths needs to include new technologies and new content and so on, all becomes quite tricky, right? at a time when generally the direction about curriculum is saying there's too much and maths has squeezed other things out, and that's the pressure on government. So there are an awful lot of dynamics going on here that mean that us saying what's wrong, which is what we all like to do, is easy, and us moving towards solutions is much harder.
Very interesting. Yes, I should also say that the Royal Society were not the only people to be talking about Key Stage 3 assessments. We had a report last month from OCR, one of the big exam boards, who also said that we should introduce what they called a benchmarking qualification, taken on screen in maths and also in English too, to highlight gaps in students' knowledge and provide structure to Key Stage 3. But as you both said, there's plenty of trade-offs to take into account when trying to design something like that. And is it the right way to think about assessment first and curriculum second? I'd say probably almost certainly not. Okay, we are almost at the end of this episode, so it's time for one last question for today. One of the most interesting elements to me of the government's curriculum and assessment review is that they want to deliver an evolution, not a revolution, which is why, for instance, the review has already ruled out scrapping GCSEs and A-levels. So in that context, my question is, if the government asked you how maths education should evolve over the next few years after the review has concluded, what should that evolution look like? Lynn, if the goal is evolution, not revolution, what would be your priorities for reforming maths education?
I think that the Key Stage 3 bit fits with evolution, not revolution, because it's inserting something into a system that already exists and into a structure that already exists. I think there is more to be done post-16 with more relevant mathematics for people who are not taking mathematics as their main subject. And I do think that most students are perfectly capable of doing some mathematics post-16 as long as it is seen as relevant. And I think the relevance is important. So we know we've got T levels where we've got mathematics embedded in T levels. But if students are going to want to study geography or economics or biology, actually they're going to need some mathematics if they're going to go on and study post-18, post-19. And so giving them something which is especially computer-based mathematics and data is really important. So I see that as evolution, not revolution. And I think there are ways of getting data and digital literacy into curricula without them being throwing everything out with the bathwater and starting all over again. I do think there are ways of doing that. I was either lucky or unlucky, depending on which way you look at it, because I chaired the last national curriculum reviews, both for primary and secondary. And I like to say that the curriculum, although it's not that good, is better than it would have been if I hadn't been involved, which is my sort of excuse for talking about it. And there were lots of things wrong with it. The government at the time was very, very keen on talking about comparisons between Singapore. No, they do that in year 5 and we don't do it until year 6. What is the reason for that, etc. So I think there are ways of inserting things, but I do think that more digital literacy and more data is, we can't put that off.
Thank you, Lynn. David, what would a sensible evolution of maths education look like in your view?
I just say to Lynn that I think all of the international evidence about England's progress since that curriculum suggests you did a pretty good job. I'd be predictable. I think we need to look at the experience that children having Key Stage 3, where they are doing a repeat of Key Stage 2 and missing out on all of the richness of mathematics that they should be having, that should be pushing them and stretching them intellectually and challenging them. And they are finding the subject too boring, not because of anything about relevance. I think that relevance becomes much more important post-16, and I'll agree with Lynn in a minute. But when 11 and 12, they should be doing interesting, challenging mathematics that is pushing them intellectually where they feel like they're learning and growing in the classroom. And that's what's not happening at the moment. I think we should be looking at how we're spreading out content across Key Stage 2 and 3, seeing that as the unit, such that we are allowing for the development of their mathematical understanding over that time, with plenty of space for them to be really pushing themselves, stretching themselves and doing difficult things with the mathematics they know. And that's absolutely what we need to be doing. So I would be pushing us to do that. I think that's evolution, not revolution. And I'll say very similar things about post-16. Again, and that is evolution, not revolution. We have core maths. I think people have done a really good job bringing that into the system, building that as a qualification. Schools and colleges running that, doing a really good job. But it is not systematically doing the job that it needs to. I don't think we can say that our school system is turning out people ready for adulthood in the current world if they don't understand really anything about statistics. I think that's a really big problem in terms of people being able to function as informed citizens in the world that we live in. And we could absolutely be building on what we have with core maths to be putting in place a qualification, well, a curriculum and then a qualification that more people are taking and more people are benefiting from. So that's what I want to see there.
Thank you, David. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Lynn and David for sharing their insights on maths education in primary and secondary education. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave us a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join us when we next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.